China is one of the biggest potential losers if the Strait of Hormuz stays disrupted. That is the fact almost everybody agrees on. China buys enormous volumes of oil. A huge share of that oil moves through Hormuz. If that route breaks, Chinese factories feel it, Chinese energy planners feel it, and Beijing's whole economic system comes under pressure. So then why did China veto the resolution? That is where this story begins, because the real story is not that China backed Iran. The real story is that China looked at the so-called solution and decided the solution was more dangerous than the disruption. That is the key. Once you see that, the whole picture changes on the 7th of April inside the United Nations Security Council. A resolution came to a vote. On the surface, it sounded simple. Restore freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz, open the route, calm the market, protect the global economy. That is how it was presented. And within minutes, the Western narrative hardened into something clean and familiar. China and Russia had sided with Iran. They had shielded a destabilizing regime. They were blocking the reopening of a waterway the whole world needs, simple, clear, and deeply misleading, because almost nobody wanted to slow down long enough to ask the obvious question. Iran is one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil on Earth, and if Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points on the planet, why would Beijing block a measure that appears to reopen that route? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the whole question. And once you answer it honestly, the board flips. This was never really a story about opening a shipping lane. It was a story about authorizing a power structure. The phrase that mattered most in the whole episode was not freedom of transit. It was all necessary means. That phrase was the real heart of the resolution, because in diplomatic language, all necessary means is not neutral wording. It is permission. It is a legal bridge between a crisis and a military solution. It is a way of saying that force can now be used under international cover. It is how a narrow issue becomes a precedent. That is why the revisions matter so much. The original resolution was far more aggressive. It would have created a path for military action to reopen the strait. China pushed back. Russia pushed back. Even countries that are not automatically aligned with Beijing or Moscow were uncomfortable. The language was softened. References to offensive force were stripped down. Then the draft was diluted again, and still China vetoed it. That detail is crucial because it tells you Beijing. S objection was not only about how to force the resolution openly authorized. The objection ran deeper. Even after the language had been watered down, China still saw the same strategic structure inside it. And that strategic structure was simple. If the United States and its partners gain back legitimacy to use force around Hormuz, then the result is not just an open shipping route. The result is an American victory over one of the most important choke points in the global energy system. That is the real issue. And from Beijing's perspective, that outcome is far more dangerous than the immediate disruption itself. This is the first layer of the veto, and you have to understand it before anything else makes sense. If Washington can step into Hormuz with international legitimacy, impose order through force, and prove to the entire world that even in a time of supposed American decline, it still controls access to one of the most critical energy arteries on Earth, then China has just been reminded of its deepest strategic nightmare. Dependence. Not just dependence on foreign oil, dependence on an American managed maritime order. That is the nightmare. Beijing has been trying to escape for years. Chinese strategic thinkers have had a name for part of this problem for a very long time, the Malacca dilemma. The fear that the U.S. Navy can choke China's economy by controlling key sea lanes has been sitting inside Chinese strategic thinking for decades. Now imagine that fear expanding from Southeast Asian choke points into the Persian Gulf itself. Imagine the message if Washington reopens Hormuz by force under a UN-endorsed mandate while Beijing can do nothing but watch. That is not just a tactical loss. That is a strategic humiliation. It tells the world and tells China that the roots feeding the world's largest manufacturing economy still run through a system whose ultimate guardian is the United States. That is why the first conclusion is so important. If America wins this round cleanly, China loses something larger than barrels. It loses room. It loses leverage. It loses time in its long struggle to reduce reliance on a maritime order built under American primacy. From that perspective, the veto was not optional. It was necessary. Now we move to the second layer, because this is where most commentary becomes extremely shallow. Most people stop at the obvious pain. Yes, a disrupted Hormuz hurts China. Energy prices rise, shipping risk rises, industrial costs rise. All of that is true, but Beijing is not playing a one-week game. It is not even playing a one-year game. China is willing to absorb short-term pain if that pain accelerates a larger structural shift in the global system. That is the deeper logic, and the structural shift here revolves around the dollar. The petrodollar system has been one of the hidden foundations of American power for half a century. Oil priced in dollars creates constant global demand for dollars. That demand reinforces us financial dominance, helps support American deficits, and sends global liquidity back into dollar assets. When the oil system works smoothly, the broader American financial architecture works more smoothly too. Now think about what happens when Hormuz remains unstable. The damage is not limited to energy flows. The damage starts reaching the dollar system built around those flows. If Gulf exports become less stable, the petrodollar recycling mechanism weakens. Dollars tied to energy trade do not circulate as cleanly back into American assets. The financial system starts feeling pressure at the same moment the energy system does. That matters because China has spent years building alternatives for exactly this kind of environment. Yuan settlement channels, cross-border payment systems, belt and road financial plumbing, energy integration with Russia and Iran. None of these alternatives can fully replace the dollar in normal times. That is true, but that is also not the point. The point is that instability creates experimentation. The point is that when the traditional system looks less reliable, even imperfect alternatives start looking attractive. That is what Beijing sees every week. That Hormuz remains unresolved is another week the old dollar-centered energy system looks less automatic. Every week of instability is another week in which more countries quietly ask themselves whether they need more options, more redundancies, and less dollar dependence. That is why the veto stops looking contradictory once you zoom out. Yes, China pays short-term pain, but China may be buying long-term transformation, and from Beijing's point of view, that trade can make sense. Now we come to the third layer, and this is the part many critics of China completely miss. They assume China made this move out of ideological reflex or loyalty to Iran or anti-American instinct. I think that is too shallow. China did not make this move because it loves disruption. China made this move because it has spent years preparing for disruption that matters. China is not approaching this crisis as an improviser. It has been stockpiling petroleum reserves, diversifying suppliers, building overland routes, investing in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, working with Russia and Iran on transport corridors, and building domestic energy capacity on a scale the rest of the world still struggles to grasp. Solar, wind, nuclear, coal, flexibility, reserve management, infrastructure redundancy, all of it fits the same long-term logic. Be less vulnerable when the system breaks. So when the shock arrives, Beijing does not see only the immediate hit. It sees a stress test. And in that stress test, China may judge itself to be better prepared than many of the players calling for an immediate restoration of the old order. That does not mean China is comfortable. It means China believes it can absorb pain more effectively than its rivals if the pain produces a larger structural shift. That is a very different position from simple fear of disruption. And once you understand that, the veto begins to look much more deliberate. Beijing was not simply refusing to reopen a route it was refusing to hand its rival an internationally legitimized strategic victory inside the very energy system China has been trying to de-risk for years. Now we move to the legal and moral layer, because this is the part that gives China something even more valuable than leverage. It gives China narrative power inside the Security Council. The Chinese position emphasized that the resolution did not address the root causes of the crisis. Russia said something similar. You do not have to agree with Beijing's moral framing to see why it matters globally, because much of the non-Western world has been watching the same pattern for years. Intervention first, justification later, military action first, legal language after. So when a resolution appears that even in softened form still looks like a path toward legitimized force against the very state that was first hit militarily, many countries outside the Western alliance do not see a neutral effort to preserve order. They see precedent, and precedent matters. If China can frame itself as the state saying we will not automatically approve military force dressed up as transit protection, then Beijing is not just protecting a position in one crisis. It is building a much larger image defender of sovereignty, skeptic of selective enforcement, critic of rules that seem to apply most strongly to adversaries of the West. That story plays well across parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And that matters because wars are never fought only with weapons. They are fought with narratives, with legitimacy, with the ability to define who looks defensive and who looks imperial. In that sense, the veto was not just a move inside a legal institution. It was an act of geopolitical storytelling. China was telling the global South, we are the side trying to stop another escalation authorized in the language of order. And the United States, fairly or unfairly, was once again left looking like the power that acts first and seeks legal cover after. That is a strategic narrative win. Now we arrive at the largest layer of all. This is not only a story about Hormuz, it is a story about the world system. For decades after the Cold War, the United States operated with a kind of institutional freedom that no previous great power had ever really enjoyed. If Washington wanted to intervene, pressure, sanction, isolate, or legalize its preferred course of action, it often had enough room to do it. Russia was weak. China was not yet ready to resist at scale. The structure of global order bent heavily toward American convenience. That era is ending. And the 7th of April veto is one of the clearest signs of that shift, because here was the United States going to the UN to secure legitimacy for something it framed as essential, keeping open one of the world's most critical energy choke points. And it failed not because of procedure, not because of logistics, not because of time, because two major powers said no. That is what multipolarity looks like when it stops being theory and becomes event. A visible limit, an enforceable limit, a limit attached to one of the most important strategic arteries on Earth. That is why the vote mattered so much. It demonstrated that the Security Council is no longer an automatic extension of American strategic necessity, and that changes the board. Once you look at the episode across all four dimensions, the picture sharpens completely militarily. China did not fire a shot, but it shaped the strategic environment by denying legal cover to force. Economically, it accepted short-term energy pain to preserve a longer-term challenge to the petrodollar order and American maritime primacy. Politically, it positioned itself as a defender of sovereignty and a critic of selective intervention. Narratively, it gained the ability to tell a compelling story to the global South about rules, power, and resistance to unilateral escalation. That is an extraordinary amount of gain from one vote, which is why I think the most important conclusion is this. China did not veto a resolution because it was confused about its interests. It vetoed the resolution because it understood its interests more clearly than the people accusing it of obstruction. The real question was, why would China block a resolution to reopen a route? It depends on, the real question was always, why would China help legitimize an American military solution that would restore the very strategic order Beijing has been trying to escape for years? That is the answer. That is the meaning of the veto. And that is why this moment matters far beyond the Strait. This was not hesitation. It was not nervousness. It was not defensive reaction. It was a declaration that the old system no longer gets to restore itself automatically. China did not block a simple solution. It blocked a restoration of American control disguised as neutral order. That is why the world saw the vote. But almost nobody understood it.